Hi everybody, welcome back to Capricorn Radio TV. This is your host James and I'm joined on the call today with my co-host Heather. Hi Heather, you with me?
Hi, I'm here, James. It's great to be here.
Great to see you, Heather, and of course you are taking the reins today. We're going to be talking to our good friend, returning guest, Mr. Stephen Mehler. And we normally talk to Stephen about megaliths and we normally talk to Stephen about Egypt, but today we're going to talk to Stephen about Goddess Mythology. And this is something you're extremely well versed in, Heather, and Stephen, I believe, too. And it's something I'm going to be very surprised to hear all these juicy details about Goddess Mythology. So I'm going to open the floor for you, Heather, to take the reins today.
Great, thank you. So, Stephen, what I thought we would do is start with talking about your first master's degree that you did, where you did a specialized degree, didn't you, that relates to this subject. Can you tell us a little about it?
Yes, actually, it was my first master's degree, but what you're talking about is my second master's. My first
Oh,
master's,
okay.
well, let's take it back to where we can actually start my interest in the subject, which began, say, for people, and now this is really ancient history for a lot of people, but we're going back to the late 60s. I graduated, I was as an undergraduate in 1967, and at that time I was into the hard sciences, so I started out as a chemistry major because I loved chemistry and I wanted to find out the building blocks of life, and I thought chemistry was a field for me. But then going to higher mathematics, I couldn't go any further. Calculus always killed me. I couldn't even understand it. So I actually switched as an undergraduate and became pre-med. So I had an idea of wanting to go into research, always wanting to do research, and wanted to go maybe into medical research. So my undergraduate degree was in physiology and anatomy with a minor in chemistry. But then at that time when I graduated was the height of the U.S.-the Vietnam War. And immediately upon my graduation, I had been student deferment for 4 years. 2 weeks after I graduated, I got a notice that I would be drafted. So I had to make a decision. I tried to get into graduate schools, didn't work for me then. To make a long story short, I spent 4 years in the U.S. Air Force. During that time, I spent those 4 years to research things that I hadn't had time for as an undergraduate that I really wanted to do. And one of those, and this, it's interesting that James introduced this as, you usually talk to me about Egypt, but this seems like a totally unrelated subject, but it's not, because I'm going to show you how they both manifested at the same time. As I said, I wanted to spend those 4 years studying things I had never had a chance to as an undergraduate, and I'd always been interested in Sigmund Freud, particularly his theories of the unconscious, his theories of dreams. I came across a used paperback. This was actually a discussion I've had with James and other people when we talk about Egypt. The book was called Moses and Monotheism. It was the last work Freud did before he passed, 6 months before he passed. And again, I talk about that in greater detail, but it got me into that idea of Egypt and archaeology and ancient history. That was going to be my goal. Then I got in the, when I got out of the Air Force in 1972, I went to do graduate work at San Jose State University. That's when I started doing work in what we call the field. I did design my own master's program, but it was called human ecology. I got interested in past human civilizations and how human beings related to the different environments. And in that, I began to take a lot of anthropology courses at San Jose State University. And this is now the 70s. So I'm going to talk about this as a history thing, but this now begins what we call the second wave of feminism. I'm going to talk about the first wave because it's important for our research and discussion. But this becomes the second wave of feminism. I got caught up with a lot of women who were getting their doctorates in anthropology, had already gotten their doctorate in anthropology, were teaching at San Jose State University, and were staunch feminists. I became a feminist. So they got me interested in the idea of goddess religions or perhaps ancient matriarchies. As I began to study Egypt more and more, and I mentioned the last time with you and James, a classic book, I recommend this book highly to all students. The book is called The Splendor That Was Egypt. The woman's name is Margaret Murray. She was British. She was a devout student of the great Sir William Flinders Petrie, the father of modern archaeology and Egyptology. She was the first woman to get a doctorate in Egyptology in 1903. So she became part of the first wave of feminism, which became in the 20s and 30s, which led to women being to vote, and a great interest in the subject. Then became a dead period where she got a doctorate. It wasn't 50 years later till another woman got a doctorate in the field of Egyptology. And this became now the 70s. It became in the 50s. Now the 70s, you get the second wave. You get a lot of women getting doctorates in anthropology, women getting doctorates in Egyptology. A woman named Barbara Lesko, Lesko, I think she still teaches at Brown University. She wrote a pamphlet in 1972 called Remarkable Woman of Ancient Egypt. That got me immediately. And then again, Margaret Murray's book, The Splendor That Was Egypt, which came out in 1949, she was basically saying, using coded language, because she couldn't come out and say it. She was the only woman in the field. All her male colleagues poo-pooed the subject, the idea, but she basically was stating that ancient Egypt was a matriarch. But she didn't say it in those direct words. So now I entered into the field. In the early 70s, I'd already gotten my first master's degree, but I got involved in the Women's Studies Department at San Jose State University, and I became a staunch feminist. And I began to academically research ancient matriarchies, ancient goddess worship. Goddess worship cannot be separated from the fact of matriarchy. And so I became very friendly with an anthropologist named Jo Stewart. She gave me for a birthday present a book which changed the whole story. It was a book called, and I got it sitting right here to this day, called Myth, Religion, and Mother Right, written by a Swiss man named J.J. Bachhofen. It was published first in the 1860s, 1870s, didn't get published in English, of course in German, until 1926, so it became part of the first wave of feminism. But Bachhofen, now he's a great story. He was a Swiss man, became very interested in law, not only became a lawyer, but wanted to know the history of law. So he studied law, particularly Roman law, because it was obvious that the whole Western civilization was based on a Greco-Roman model. Now we know that's a false model based on our work in Kemet and ancient Egypt. But everything was based on Roman law. So he became a student of Roman law, and particularly went to Rome in the 1860s twice and studied the catacombs, began to study inscriptions on tombs. He realized there was a whole compendium, corpus, of Roman law that was emphasizing father right, saying that descent had to go to father to son, very clear laws, very detailed laws. It made him think that maybe this was a reaction, that this was not just, if it had been something that was natural, had been always been that way, there wouldn't be a reason to have all these laws. The laws were a reaction to a previous system. The more he began to investigate, the more he discovered matriarchy. And he was the first great scholar of the 19th century to come forward and say that there were ancient matriarchies before patriarchy. He influenced many people. Like I said to you, I have a stack of books sitting here. I mean, you actually had a conversation with me where I may have gotten this wrong, but you said that you had a professor that said that the subject had never been scholarly researched?
Yes, I mean, my experience was very negative compared to yours, and that's what I want to talk to you about because,
this was the 70s. You see,
yeah,
this was the 70s.
exactly,
Things
exactly.
It's time for a new wave of feminism now, which is what is happening.
Right. We're supposedly like coming out of the third wave of feminism into the fourth wave. And, I teach women in gender roles. And one of the things I teach with my students about, the creation of women's studies courses is that, the late 60s and the early 70s, and when you were going to school, I mean, this was quite radical, wasn't it? Did you get a lot of academic flack at the time?
There is no longer a women's studies department, you see. There was a women's studies department at San Jose State at this time. So I was able to get a second master's degree. It was covered, umbrellaed behind social sciences. So I have a master's degree in natural sciences and a master's degree in social sciences. But the women's studies department at that time was under the social sciences department, was a separate department. You had women who taught in the history department, women who taught anthropology, taught archaeology, taught history, all came to teach into women's studies. So I actually have a master's degree in women's studies. And my master's project was the role and position of women in Egypt for 6,000 years, from 7,000 to 1000 BC. And we can talk about that because 8,000 BC is the time of what is known as the Neolithic period, which was a great age of matriarchy. There was great matriarchies at this time. But we take it even further back in Egypt. Matriarchies go back to 13,000, 20,000, 30,000 BC. There was matriarchy. So it's obvious there was more matriarchy before there was patriarchy. But then to go back to you, to follow, Bachhofen then influenced a whole generation of late 19th century scholars. You have a great student of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, whose name was Erich Neumann. He wrote a book, The Great Mother, a great book. You had a British man named Robert Briffault, and I can spell these all out. We can get all these references for your students, for anybody who wants to know. He wrote an incredible 3-volume set almost 1,000 pages. Nobody could read something like this today, called The Mothers. And then there was a great scholar, anthropologist, a Morgan, who did a study of the Iroquois and clearly showed the correct name, Haudenosaunee. Iroquois is another name, but the Haudenosaunee were a matriarchy. And a lot of Native American groups, then in the 19th century, a lot of anthropologists were studying a lot of Native American groups, not just the Iroquois, the Cherokee. There's many, many others who were strictly matriarchal. So then they began to realize, well, maybe patriarchy wasn't always the way it was. And so there was a wave of scholarship that's led to now, as I said, to the women in the 60s and 70s. You had a great book, a woman I knew named Merlin Stone. I recommend this book highly, called When God Was a Woman, came in 1976. She referenced all the great scholars of the 19th century. And so it was a very academic work. Then there's a great Marija Gimbutas, a great PhD in anthropology, who wrote about the goddess cults, which you know about in Europe, and all the great books she wrote about goddess mythology. So that was the second wave, and I was right in it. I attended a conference. This is great. I love to tell this story, because this is the time I was a raging feminist. This was in 1978 at University of California, Santa Cruz. It was a goddess conference. Only 8 men were invited, allowed to come. I was one of the 8, with 200 women. In these days, you had the radical feminists and the radical lesbians. And so we had to be confronted. Oh, why are you men here? You just come here to rip off more women's power and culture. So we had to, they showed that we were feminists and we were into goddess and we were blessed by Isis and all that, so that we could attend the conference. But it was an incredible conference. And so, yeah, that was my master's project, was that ancient Egypt was a matriarchy, without a doubt. Without a doubt. And there's no doubt for anybody to deny it. Again, the scholarship is there. We could list scholarly works up to degrees of all people who studied, and even many of the great anthropologists know that now. But, again, like, you're part of a new generation again. In the 70s, it exploded with all these women. Then it got conservative again. It happened in the U.S. The 70s were a great decade for me. It was a great decade of exploration. I got deep into Egyptology, self-taught myself Egyptology. But then the 80s, we had Reagan come in the U.S., conservatism, and the conservatism hit academia too. And academics were not allowed to get tenure, to keep their positions. A great, great story is a woman named Virginia Steen McIntyre. Not necessarily a feminist, but listen to this story. Her PhD was actually in geology, but she was doing a great archaeological expedition in the 90s in Mexico. She found an occupation site that all the dating systems she used dated the site to 125,000 years ago. And this is against all of anthropology theory. And you got the stupid Bering Land, the Sea Bridge theory, where the people didn't come to the New World until 15,000 years ago, which is nonsense. So she published, and she already had tenure, and yet she was fired. They invented some reason to fire her, and she lost her job because she continued to publish that. And this is how conservative things got in the 90s, and now it's time to bring it back, because in the 70s, was when all these women were getting doctorates, like I said, in anthropology and the feminist movement. And there was a lot of talk about goddess mythology and matriarchy. And they go hand in hand. You can't discuss one without the other. Because there's no doubt that there were thousands and thousands of years when descent only went from mother to daughter. And nobody got into this to the level that my Hakim did about Egypt, about Kemet, how it was in Kemet. Is that the woman was to be venerated. Why Isis, Izet, the correct name, is shown on a throne with her feet off the floor, is because in their life, not just the goddess, but the woman of the house too, who was known as the Hemet, the Hemeti. Today, again, what we teach when we teach our chematology is how meanings of words and even definitions, labels, are reversed today in the patriarchal world as they were in the matriarchal world. Even to say the words that are yes in the ancient are now no. And there are many examples of that. And so everything is reversed. In fact, the great mystic Gurdjieff used to say the world is topsy-turvy today. So definitions are reversed the way it was. So it was the woman who was to be venerated, who was to be exalted, and she was to have her feet off the floor. So the word today, Hemet, in Arabic, in Egyptian Arabic, means mother-in-law. So this is not somebody to be venerated. This is to be hated, to be feared, the mother-in-law. So The ancient definition of the term in Commission is woman of power. Woman of power becomes mother-in-law.
That's
Just like
amazing.
just like the Sphinx, who is Tefnut, the mother, the aspect of the great mothers we talked about last time. Today, in Arabic, in Egyptian, she's called Abuhol, the father of terror. So I always, when I lecture, I always say, how did the great mother become the father of terror?
Why do you think the Egyptologists are so threatened by this concept of the matriarchal society? Why do they cover this up? Like, what are some of the big lies that they're perpetuating?
It happened. That was what was in anthropology too. Many males in the field of anthropology in the 70s, like myself, went along with it and realized it. The new generations who come in the 80s and 90s have blocked it and gone back to more sexist behavior. Again, it's in waves. So it's like we need a new wave of feminism. If they don't want to see the forest for the trees, so they don't pretend like this is not scholarship. No one's done a good, like your professor said to you. I mean, that's appalling. I would have brought that person to the library and had them look at about 50 volumes of scholarly work since the 19th century in the fact of mother right and goddess worship. And again, Jung saw it as a great archetype. That's why he had his student Neumann investigate it and wrote this great book, The Great Mother. It is a classic archetype in every culture. Only since Judaism did the goddess disappear, but she hasn't disappeared. This is what I point out in my second book. In Judaism, they have what is called the correct Hebrew pronunciation is Shekhinah. In English, it's pronounced Shekinah. They actually, Rosicrucians use it in a ceremony, but it becomes not something embodied. It's an altar, a shrine. It represents the feminine aspect of God. In Judaism, that's there. They did away with the goddess. They eliminated her, wiped her out. And there's many stories of in Solomon's temple that they used to have these staffs. These wooden staffs are called Ashira. Ashira, from Ashira, the goddess Ashira, Canaanite goddess, that even when they began to introduce Judaism, the people still were falling back into debt. I mean, that's the whole story of the calf in the desert. The calf represents Hathor, the whole story of the Exodus, where the Israelites are in the desert for 40 days, and they rebel against Moses. Where is this God? Where is the food and water? Where's this promised land? So they take all their gold and their jewels and their gold out of their teeth and everything, and they build it. They have Aaron, who's the smith, brother of Moses, make a golden calf. Well, who is that? That's Hathor. They're going back to worshiping the goddess. And so then Yahweh has to come back and destroy the goddess, right? Because the God has to defeat the goddess. It's in everything. So, but they would have these poles that they would put up in the temple where Yahweh's temple was that represented the goddess. They were called Ashira. And it talks about that. They had to get rid of it. So they never really got it. And what, of course, is in Christianity, you have to bring the goddess back, but she has to be a virgin. So she's the Mother Mary, right? They eliminate his wife, Mary, which is another story, who wasn't a virgin, and neither was Mary a virgin. And actually, the word is wrong. It's translated from the ancient Hebrew. A virgin didn't mean a woman who didn't have sex. It just meant a woman who was not married. Exactly. And in fact, in Judaism, it was okay to sleep with a woman before you married her, because you had to break her in. Not for her, just for him. So, it could be that Mother Mary had sex before Joseph and all that. But the whole idea, I mean, we could go into the mythologies. As you say, the mythologies are so rich. And I have tons and tons of books on the mythologies and can, recommend. And of course, the greatest was Joseph Campbell. And his works were incredible, dealing with the goddess mythology, the hero mythology, all myths, gods and goddesses. I mean, and again, Marija Gimbutas has done the great about the goddesses in Europe.
And the thing about Gimbutas, even today, we still have academics disputing her findings, saying, oh no, these goddess figures were just fetishes and dolls. I mean, what is their problem?
Unbelievable. Well, it's like I tell you, you come with me to Egypt, and I'll just sit you in front of the Sphinx, and you tell me if she's female, male or female. And I know you will know. Every woman knows that looks at her. And even men now are getting it. That's not a man. It's a woman. It's a female. The energy is female. The energy is motherly. It's protective. It's loving. It's embracing. It's not a male figure at all. And yet they still resent that. They still fight it today. In fact, you have one of the alternative researchers who has a whole camp on his side, a man named Robert Temple, Temple, who says the Sphinx is Anubis. It's a male symbol. It's because he represents the necropolis, the burial grounds. But the Pisa Plateau was not a burial ground. And she is the alpha and the omega, the first thing ever constructed above ground in Egypt 54,000 years ago was an aspect of the Great Mother. And so the goddess lasted in Egypt up until they closed the temple of Isis, something like 500 AD was the last temple of Isis was closed. You had continuous goddess worship that we can document from 14,000 BC to 525 AD, and they say there's no evidence. Again, when I gave my presentation in front of the Women's Studies Department, and these were all, I mean, it was like I was preaching to the choir. It was all that they wanted to hear about the role of women in ancient Egypt, and I was naming the women who had taken the male role. Again, we teach in chematology there were no male pharaohs. The Greeks saw the word per-a, they saw it per-a-a, and they saw it as the father and the son, because their system was patriarchal. It was mothers. It was meant the high house, the woman's house. So, but there were 5 outstanding women in the history who actually assumed the male role and took the male role as well as being per-a. And that's, of course, Cleopatra, Hatshepsut, many, many famous ones in history. And so I gave a presentation, and I was going on for 5 hours, talking about goddess worship and goddesses in ancient Egypt and all of this and all that. And I hadn't even met Hakim at that point. This was, it's 1978.
So in terms of the Sphinx, do you think that she's like the great reminder of the great mother goddess? Like she's guarding the entranceway there as a reminder of our origins of this creatrix?
Yes. In their understanding, how Hakim explained it, is when they wanted to have the idea of her manifesting in physical form, they created the mythology that we told. The great mother was that, it's called Nut, N-U-T. She controlled all, she's created and uncreated. Sort of like Kali. Very close to Kali, but there's even Durga. In the Hindu, they break it up in different aspects. She was the all one. Okay, everything was from her. But when physical form, they started to spit. And Hakim would always say, why spit? Why do we say spit? It's not a derogatory thing. Spitting, no. It means you can't define it. Every time we, again, the scientific term, expectorate, there's no volume, there's no weight. It's different each time. You can't define it. You can't define the Great Mother, but here we are. And the idea is they knew this spot. That's the point. They knew the energy areas of the Earth. This was once what we call in geology a yardang. It was just a limestone outcropping. It had no form, and the sand, that's all. That is today what is her head. And so they would go there 56,000 years ago, he said. They knew the energy was there. The water was flowing, and they would energize themselves. So that was a spot where they knew they could connect with their origins, as you say. They knew they could connect with their divinity, as we could say. They didn't use those words. They just connected with all, that's all. But then when they decided to make their first form above ground, how to represent the creatrix, the mother of all, and that's Tefnut, mother. And the head's been changed so many times. Anytime anybody looks at the statue, you can see that the head is out of proportion with the body, and so it's been changed many, many times. But as it is today, we had a dentist, of all people, a dentist, in the 1990s publish an article that said that the face of the Sphinx today is that of a black woman's face, a black African woman's face, and you particularly can see it if you look at a profile, because it has what's known in anatomy as bimaxillary prognathism. People can Google it. It just means a jutting lower jaw. It only exists in the Negroid race. It does not exist in the Caucasian or other races at all. And so he was right, and I have researched it. It's actually, we believe that one of the first men who united with the idea of a united kingdom, a Kemet, together, wanted to honor his mother, so he recarved the face, whatever it was at that point, probably recarved many times, into an aspect of his mother. And so it is a black African woman's face, even today. But you get very few Egyptologists who would say that. I actually had a tour guide that I sat him down in front of the Sphinx, and I explained the whole story to him. He came back to me the next day, and he told me he couldn't sleep that night. But no, because the Sphinx kept coming to him as a woman and yelling at him. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't believe it.
That's fantastic.
But most of them, most of them don't agree. Again, the resistance is there today. That's why I say we need a new wave, a new wave. And I see it. I see it in people your age. I see it in younger people. I mean, that's why we have LGBT now. We have no longer, gay marriage is okay. It's because of young folks. Young folks just decided this wasn't the issue anymore. People are people, this and that. And I think you get more younger males now who could be more open, who are coming into academia perhaps, maybe will become Egyptologists, maybe will become anthropologists, would be more open to goddess worship and matriarchy, because there's no doubt about it. I mean, again, I say it as an actuality, it's not theory to me. I mean, the scholars that did this work, and the evidence is complete in Egypt, complete. The women had the dominant role, there's no doubt about it. There can go to story after story after story. There are papyruses that have been found from the so-called Middle Kingdom period. Now again, as the history of what we call dynastic Egypt, Kemet, happens, it's becoming more and more patriarchal as it's being influenced by outside influences, by the Greeks, later by the Romans, later by the Hebrew, by Judaism. But even at this point, we have this papyrus where it was a law case, where a brother was suing his sister in court for the property because their parents had not left a will. Even in those days, people made wills. And this is 1800 BCE, if you want to date. And first of all, he didn't have a chance to begin with. All the judges in Kemet from the Old Kingdom, we're talking about 5,000 years ago, 3000 BCE, till the end of Cleopatra VII, the last ruler, all the judges were only women. There never were male judges in Turkey. Never. There were male advocates, defense attorneys, prosecutors, but never judges. Judges were the Ma'at. Ma'at is the divine principle, goddess, if you will. We say again, these are not goddesses, then that's their principles. The principle of divine order of the universe. She represented cosmic order, not human law, not human balance, but the balance of the universe, cosmic law. So Ma'at was always the divine principle in any trial, in any courtroom scene in Kemet, even through patriarchal dynastic times. So the upshot is, this case is the guy lost the case, completely lost the case, thrown out of court. You could not sue your sister because the descent went from mother to daughter, up until the end, up until Cleopatra VII. She was the seventh woman who took that title, 33 BCE. It was still matriarchy.
And you know, my reading of the Isis and Osiris myth, because I told you I'm writing about that for my book, like my own archetypal journey and how that matches up with the Isis myth. And I see it as such an empowering matriarchal myth, but yet we see so many modern researchers emphasizing Osiris and Orion. So what's going on there? Like this patriarchal emphasis again, rather than on Isis.
You mean Isis and you mean Osiris and Horus, father and son.
Right.
Well, let's tell it like it is. Iset was perhaps one of the greatest fulfillments of the goddess archetype there was, because she ruled or dominated or was influenced over so many different things. And the myth shows that, shows her power to conceive without the male. She performs the first act, we say, of procreative alchemy. What does the myth say? The original oldest story has it that there were two sets of twins, Iset and Wizard, who's Osiris, and Set, Sutek, and Nephet, who's Nephthys. Two twins. Set, though, becomes jealous because in the patriarchal version of the story, Wizard is chosen to be the great ruler. But of course, it's because of her. In the ancient matriarchal understanding, again, Iset sits on the throne. Horus comes through her. A man throughout pre-dynastic and dynastic Kemet only had power through his mother or through his consort. That's why they married their sisters. It had nothing to do with incest. It had to do with power and keeping the family line. And power only went through the woman. So Iset is already pictured. She's on the throne. She's the one that gives Wizard Osiris the right to rule. But he's then thought of as the good king. Everybody loves him. So Set becomes jealous, decides to have his people, his group, his followers, and they're going to plot to destroy Osiris, Isaac, Wizard. And they take him and they lock him in a coffin. First they tear his body into 42 pieces. Now Plutarch, the Roman historian, later tells the story of 14. And 14 is interesting because there are 14 key initiation sites, temples that people went to. So 14 was key, but the original story is 42 because there were 42 tribes of Kemet. A piece of the master is given to each tribe. But the story then becomes that Isis mourns for her husband, she searches for him, and there's many, many different versions of the story. She winds up going to Lebanon. It proves that, what we did, we just went to Baalbek, and we proved that the ancient Phoenician civilization was part of Kemet, because the story, she goes to Lebanon, She lands at Byblos, in fact, where the Bible was written. He's in a tree. She finds his body. She puts it all back together, only 41 pieces. Which piece is missing, we used to ask people in fun. His phallus, his penis. She can't find it. It was swallowed by a fish in the Nile. And that fish became sacred. Even to this day, Egyptians will not eat this fish. It became sacred. But what does she do? She performs the first act of procreative alchemy. She straddles the body of wizard Osiris, and she conceives magically herself. You see how the Greeks turned the story around, and then you have Zeus being able to create Athena out of his forehead without a mother. They changed the story that man could create without woman, which is because it's biologically impossible. But it has been shown that certain women throughout history have gotten pregnant without having sexual intercourse. A lot of that happens in the church, and the Catholic Church considers it miracles when it happened. You know, Jesus came in and conceived for her, blah, 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 and that's how Jesus was conceived, and all of that. But the myth here was she conceived without the male. He's dead, but she brings him back to life to produce the son, Horus, Har, the boy who becomes the man, the Avenger, and he battles Osiris, wizard, and that's the story the Greeks, the Romans concentrated on, the battle of the son, defeating his uncle, and the son becomes the king. Interesting understanding that we came to years ago, which many, many scholars today have not recognized. Some have recognized that there was matriarchy went to patriarchy, but it's assuming that patriarchy was the father or the husband taking the role of the wife, and it was not. It was the son taking the role of the mother. And Hakim used to tell an interesting story, and there is an interesting mythology involved with this that goes to Babylon. In Babylon, which was a great patriarchal civilization, had a lot of battles with the Jews, as we know, kept them in captivity. In the town square of Babil, which was the capital city, there was a statue of Marduk, who was the state god. He was what everybody based on. But the statue showed him with a sword splitting his mother, Tiamat, in two. Many, many people have played with this myth. I can give you, there's actually a man named Tom Van Flandern. I've discussed him with James. He talks about the exploding planet theory. There was a planet between the Earth and Mars, and that's what's known as the asteroid belt today, where the asteroids come from. So he says this myth was saying that. But there are those who say the myth is actually talking about a literal fact of the defeat of matriarchy by patriarchy, is what the statue is showing, and it's the son taking the role of the mother. How Hakim would describe it. Because we had a lot of anger that came out of the 60s and 70s, a lot of radical feminists, a lot of women became staunch lesbians, hated men, and men were the enemy, the devil, and all that, and that never solved any problems. But that happened for a long time, and that overweight still is there a lot in the lesbian community. A real hatred of men, understanding men took our power. We had the power, and men took our power. Well, Hakim would say there was no one to blame. It was a natural, cyclical thing. As women began to lose consciousness, as we're moving from the cycle. We were once in a cycle where we're all using 360 senses. That's when we built pyramids. There were no gods and goddesses. Everybody had a connection to the divine. They understood the feminine, understood that there were no statues, there was no religion. That's how ancient Kemet was. Everybody was in the spiritual bliss 24/7, using 360 senses. But as the senses started to wane, different people got lost consciousness of these things. So there would be a thing that if a woman had many sons, and it's just played out throughout history, now recorded history, particularly if you look at English recorded history, the Tudors, the Plantagenets, women would play their sons against each other, say, "You're my favorite son. You're not so good. I don't like you. I love you the best." And the sons became jealous of each other. And the sons, again, this is Cain killing Abel. This is where it comes in the Jewish myth. But in this mythology, the sons kill the mother and take her place. Matricide. And it was such, and again, Freud had it that he had it always a patriarchal beginning. When Freud talked about the beginning of civilization, it was the sons who became jealous of their father, and they killed him, and they ate him. And that fratricide became such a thing that became, they created God because of that, to replace the father that they'd eaten, and so that they would fear him, hate him, and fear him at the same time. That's how he explained Judaism, how patriarchal religion came. But in actuality, the old story is it was the sons who killed the mother. And that matricide was such a terrible thing that they had to create religion around.
It's interesting because when I was working on my PhD, I was actually studying Victorian women's literature, and I was looking at the influence of goddess mythology on writers like Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And this scholar who was like on my committee is the one who said, well, Elizabeth Barrett Browning didn't even know about goddesses. And it's like, well, how is that possible? You're supposed to be an expert on this, when she was writing poetry about goddesses. And one of the things that she said was that matriarchy ended with the rape of the Pythia at Delphi by Apollo. So it fits in exactly with what you're talking about in the sun god.
And it all was just Judaism coming in with Christianity, and then even Rome, of course, the pagans still had their goddess. They still had temples of Isis in Rome. You still had, of course, Athena and Aphrodite in Greek. But when it becomes Judaism and Christianity, and Rome becomes Christian, then the goddess has to be pushed aside. Never totally disappears. This is where they've got it all wrong. This is why the mystery groups, the Rosicrucians, the Masons, always kept goddess worship involved. The thing never totally disappeared. And if you study the metaphysical history, the metaphysical traditions, you see the goddess worship continued all throughout our patriarchal history. But it had to be in the hidden. It had to be underground. The Rosicrucians did ceremonies to the goddess too, but still it had to be veiled. It had to be secret because patriarchy was the system. And again, you see all of these stories of the Egyptian kings and the mothers getting the sons to fighting with each other, and then they turn on the mother. The history repeating itself over and over and over. But Hakim's key understanding was there's nobody to blame. It's just to come to the understanding now. And he puts it beautifully. I like to teach it this way. He would say, because he always would talk about he and his mother. He would say, I am 49 female, 51 male. So that's why I have the plumbing and I look male. My mother, she's 51 female, 49 male. So she has the plumbing female and can have children. But we are both. We are always both. And this was the thing that got us in the 70s, and when we started bringing in the spirituality, people doing Eastern mysticism, and I got involved with the Rosicrucians, that all tied together, that the feminine and the masculine don't mean male, female, and that we are. The plumbing fools us. We think the plumbing makes us so different. Hakim would always say that people have to concentrate more on the similarities than the differences. And this is where it is. This is why the yin-yang symbol. We have the light and the dark and the light. We're all masculine, we're all feminine. And this is what we do when we bring our people to our initiations in Egypt. We say, these neters, we call them, they're called gods and goddesses by Egyptologists. They're divine principles. Out and in. The energy of the site represents that principle. So when we do our meditation there, when we do our tuning there, when we do our initiations there, we awaken that sense within us. So every man discovers Isis when he goes to Philae Temple. Every woman discovers her power as Sekhmet and Isis when they go through the understanding. And that was what the initiation was all about. This is all within. Our idea is to awaken the senses within us. All these archetypes, these gods and goddesses become alive to us. They become part of us. And they become our power. It's like in the Tibetan tradition. They used to talk about the enemies, the devils, the demons. But once you know their name, and that's key. That's a key understanding with Egyptian and Commission mysticism, naming the correct title, the correct sound. Once you control the sound, you control the energy. So then those negative demons become your allies. And it's the same thing. All these gods and goddesses become, you now can have a statue of Isis on your altar, a statue of Hathor, Sekhmet. They're there with you. They become part of it. And that's the understanding of this. They're not to think about the goddess without, the god without. It's all within. And that's part of what our teaching is. These are divine principle archetypes within us. We created these religions where we created them as beings that we have to worship. But it's just energy. It's just senses, understanding.
Exactly. And one of the things I really enjoy about your work, and I feel in sync with you about, is because I too have walked the path of being an academic, but also being a spiritual person with insights and using my intuitive abilities. And we see this divorcing of those two aspects, left and right brain, or academic versus intuitive. We see that clear divorcing within our society, and one's not acceptable in the other realm. And that's very frustrating to me.
Well, this is why, as I had said in talking the last time with you guys, I had started out as a young man thinking science was the answer. I rejected religion. I rejected all these other ideas because science to me was going to be objective. Then when I became an academic, I realized it's just another game. And this is what you now understand. Most people who go into academia become dinosaurs. If they've got their doctorate, they don't have to publish or perish anymore, especially if they get tenure. All they have to do is teach the same introductory course over and over and over, collect their paycheck, not even keep up with the journals, what's new in the field, what's happening, and just, it's a job, like digging a ditch, like being a plumber, and you go and you come back home. It's the few who love to teach, absolutely love to teach, and realizing that knowledge is something that gains and changes every day. There are no absolute paradigms. There are no absolutes, no absolute theories. Everything is just changing daily. Once you have a spiritual understanding, then you go anxious to teach, because the teachers, the kids in the classroom are going to teach you as much as you're going to present to them. You're going to present what your background is, what you studied, what you've known, what you got your doctorate in, what you've written books about. But the idea, and this is what we do in Egypt, is that everybody's a teacher, everybody's a student. You're supposed to learn from your students, because the best teachers I ever had, the best teachers you ever had, were those who taught you to think for yourself, not to parrot, not to fucking go to class, but to go to class and go to the test, to just go there to say, I mean, there's a beautiful commercial on now, it's a sports commercial, but it's like, the guy just gives the introduction to the class, and somebody says, is this going to be on the test? And he says, do you mean is the name of the class going to be on the test? But there's always that kind of student, what I mean, the archetype, is this going to be on the test? I mean, the great poet, the Dead Poet Society was a great film of that, because it showed all the archetype type students, the clown, the class clown, the serious academic, everybody's like, so there's always those that just study for the test, just to get their A's, to get their degrees, and they forget about everything they've learned once they leave college. And most people do. Most people forget everything they've learned in college once they leave, unless they're in that field.
Exactly. That's why I have my students, so I also teach writing, so I have my students do a lot of writing to internalize, and I teach by discussion to get them to think for themselves, rather than just like, spoon feeding them answers. They have to find that within themselves.
Exactly. And people don't understand the fascination I have now with the internet. A lot of friends that I have don't understand it, or with Facebook. But the fact is, I scour these sites, and everybody posts on Facebook from archaeological sites, and I always tell people 98% what is posted on Facebook is disinformation. I mean, he used to say 95%, but Edward Snowden says it's over 99%. It's to take you astray, but it's that 1%, the 5%. It's whatever that we live for. You'll see a find somewhere in the world. It keeps growing, and this is the beauty of chematology. As Yusuf Awiyan has labeled his father's work, and what we do, he calls it a living book, and that's the truth. And this is why, as an oral teacher, Hakim had a natural skepticism of the written word. People would say, oh, it's in this book, it's written down. And he would always say, his famous quote was, if it had to be written down, it's not the whole truth. And that's why I say, even my books, even any book you write, is just a snapshot in time. It is what it is when you wrote it. But if it's not continuing to grow, if you're not continuing to add it, it's meaningless. It has to continue to grow. This whole life journey is just a classroom. We're here all the time learning every day, even after we draw the breath, because Hakim has proven to me, as he said, there is no death. He continues to teach to me. He continues to come to me. And the idea of just discovering the goddess archetype is so important. It's so important for a lot of men today, because we have this whole new wave of machoism. Again, I'm from the baby boomers. We had more soft, feminine. We had great, the Beatles and Simon and Garfunkel and all the great feminine, masculine men who were writing love songs and all, Bob Dylan and all that. And now you had the punk rock and then the millennials and all this. And it's now men are back to being macho and guns and, beating women again. And violence to women is at an all-time high, where it had suddenly gone down for a while. And so men have to discover that feminine within themselves, that goddess, because we all have it, just like women get their power from discovering the God within themselves.
All in balance.
Exactly.
One of the things that I find so powerful in my spiritual teaching that I do outside of my academic world is using mythology with my students to really embrace that and find their own myth or their own story. And do you find that also within Egyptian mythology, that it really is imbued with so many things and so many archetypes, that if we delve into it, we can find inner truths and inner wisdom and enlightenment through that?
Absolutely so. And in fact, again, if you study what, again, Patricia Awiyan, it was great for you to interview, because she talks about the Commission metaphysics from that archetypal, from almost a Jungian. She's almost, without being a Jungian,
Great.
coming from a Jungian perspective.
Yes, that's
So,
what I
I
use a lot.
mean, if you just look at Sekhmet, now I said Hemeti meant woman of power. Sechem means power. Sekhmet actually means the power. A lot of people define it, say she's the powerful one. And we say, no, one means deity again. She's complete. No, it's a principle. But what is the principle? Her principle is the unconditional love of mother. And to the Commissions, that was the most powerful force in the universe. The unconditional love of mother. Always forgives, always there. So that's the power of Sekhmet. But if you read Egyptology, you read even a lot of alternative researchers, what do they concentrate on? In dynastic times, she became the goddess of war. So she's the bloodthirsty goddess. And there's many mythologies of that. Let me give you one. The one that even comes back, it's the same in the Old Testament, with God wanting to destroy Noah and the flood. But in the ancient Commission story, Ra, now this is a patriarchal story, okay? Ra is, these stories become all patriarchal because in matriarchy
right.
there were no stories. Matriarchy there was just understanding. There was not
That's
stories.
right.
Stories are patriarchal, but here's the story. Ra's the king of the gods, okay? In this version, it shows us during the age of Ra, which was before, and it's maybe 5,000 BC, where this story becomes about. So he gets fed up with humans. Similar story to the Old Testament. He says, look, humans, they're corrupt, they're violent. Let's get rid of them. But how does he do it? He takes Sekhmet. He gets Sekhmet and he said, I want you to go. I want you to kill him. Kill him and eat him. Get rid of him. And so Sekhmet goes, and the more she kills, the more she gets drunk on the blood. The more she gets addicted to it. And she's ravenously killing. So finally, all the other netters, Isis, Osiris, have outdoors. They all get together. Wait a minute. There's some good in humans. We could use them. We don't want to get rid of all of them. We got to stop her. How do we stop her? And they convince Ra, we got to stop her. Okay, you can figure out how to stop her. So the classic story is they take pomegranate juice and wine, mix it together, and get her drunk so she thinks it's blood. She drinks it. She goes on a binge, and next day when she sleeps it off, she forgets about the killing. And that's the story. But you see how it's twisted in the patriarchy, and she becomes the killing machine. While in the matriarchy, she is the unforgiving, always forgiving mother. Always forgives, and that's the strength and the power. And that's why they made the first thing Tefnut, while the mother was primary. And so, you have a lot of archetypes, and a lot of people can discover that. They can discover through doing guided visualizations, which you could do with people in your classes. You want to visualize. Here's what, if you really, learn from Patricia what the goddess, the Netter really means, the symbol, Hathor, is the house of the boy. House of the boy. She defined, in other words, this shows how woman defines man. Horus, Har, is not a man, he's the boy. But Hathor, the house of the boy, she makes him a man. It's not saying even that it has to be heterosexual. No, it's not saying it has to be sexual. It's just saying woman creates man, whether he becomes gay, straight, or whatever. Woman gives the identity to man. And this is how, there's a great book called The Divine Feminine, where it talks about actually, as the Commissions understood it, not equal masculine and feminine. They saw the universe as feminine. They saw the universe as Newt. Newt calls the masculine into being. So there is a book, actually, Divine Feminine, which talks about the universe is slightly more feminine than masculine. Because the feminine calls the masculine into being, creates the masculine. So as I said, I know a lot of people have done this. As you say, in teaching your classes, you can use guided visualizations where you use the image of the Netter, and people can come up with their own stories, just like it says. They can discover the Netter within themselves. They can maybe even make a connection to their own mother, to their own sister, to their own daughter, or to their brother, father too, using all the Netters. Particularly with the goddess. Man can connect with his mother that he has not had in years.
Exactly. I was at Serpent Mound in Ohio, and I had a group on retreat there, and we were doing a guided meditation. And the thing that really surprised me that came up in my visualization as we were meditating was I saw the face and torso of Isis and the lower body of the serpent. And I'm like, well, here's this ancient connection that's been forgotten about right here in Ohio with these mound builders. So I thought that was really fascinating and powerful, to experience that.
And the interesting thing is, none of these images were just good or bad or evil. It wasn't until Judaism, Christianity, and Islam we get this idea of good, bad, and evil. They were just forces. What we would call negative and positive did not have a connotation of being bad, and even black and white, things like that. It just was the principle, and each were equal. This is why Hakim always pointed out that the concept of Set, as I said, in the mythology of Osiris, he becomes the bad guy. Becomes in Hebrew Soton, which becomes Satan. First is Saturn to the Greeks, but then becomes the devil, Satan, and becomes the bad guy. But you have many of the so-called men who became kings in Kemet who took the term Set, particularly in the so-called Second Dynasty, in the early, and then we go back to the 19th Dynasty, which is New Kingdom period, you get Seti, Seti 1, Seti 2. So they didn't see it as the devil or as evil. That again, only when patriarchy fully comes in do we have that dichotomy. Woman, man, good, bad. And man is good, woman is bad. Basically, that's what Judaism taught, picked up by Christianity and Islam. Woman is the source of all evil. That's the devil. That's the snake in the garden. But the snake in the garden wasn't the woman, first of all. The snake in the garden in the ancient version, the Kabbalah, represents consciousness, represents the conscious mind. So it's the intellect of the ego that trips. And it doesn't trip her first, it trips him. She was added later. And if you know the ancient creation mythology of Judaism, Eve was not the first woman created. Lilith was.
Exactly.
And Lilith said to God, why should I lie beneath him as his inferior? I'm his equal. And Adam supposedly comes to God and says, I can't deal with this woman. Get rid of her. And so he chases her out of the Garden of Eden. She becomes the woman at the night dreams, the succubus that waits for men to have nocturnal emissions so she can take their sperm and make demons. That's what comes out in the Kabbalah. But in the original story, Lilith is equal. That the original creation, Adam Kadmon, was a being, masculine, feminine, one body. And the original creation in Kabbalah, God cleaves into male, female, equal. No, that story doesn't work. Got to make male first. And from his rib, but it wasn't rib. The word in Hebrew didn't even mean rib. That's why it's mistranslated. See how the stories change.
Exactly.
They change the meanings of words. What was yes in Commission becomes no in Arabic. What was no in Commission becomes yes in Arabic. Change the words totally wrong.
There's an interesting matriarchal story that relates to Ireland that I've been dying to ask you about for a while. So I'm going to ask you now. So
You know who the Tuatha De Danann are?
yes. And this relates to that. So you're an expert on Akhenaten, and there are some theories out there that Akhenaten, one of his daughters, perhaps Mary Totten, was actually Princess Skoda or Princess Scotia, the Egyptian princess who founded the High Kingly line of Ireland. So in your studies or in your discussions with Hakim, did this story ever come up in terms of an explanation of that?
No, but I know who was promoting that. There's a man named Michael Fitsarian and Ralph Ellis. In fact, Ralph Ellis has written books where he actually believed that Jesus was the grandson of Cleopatra. So he makes
Written about it too, actually, but in terms of like summarizing what other people said, but
we don't see an oral tradition of that. I mean, it could be possible. I don't see it. Again, Ireland has always been thought of as being some of where the lost tribes of Israel went, so that they have a connection to Judaism before it became Christian, before it became Catholic. It's the same with Persia, which is an interesting story, because Hakim would tell stories that the Exodus, as we talk about, was the followers of Akhenaten, who we call the Seshuaten, the followers of Aten, chased out of Kemet by the Amun priests, and that is the actual Exodus. But where they went first was not Canaan, not the Holy Land, but Persia. It is actually a historical fact that before Persia adopted any form of Christianity or Islam, it was following a pre-Judaic religion, which was the Aten religion. So it's possible that that could be true. We don't know what happened to the daughters of Akhenaten. They disappeared from history, probably all murdered. Some people said, Nefertiti left too, this and that. The oral tradition states that they were destroyed, they were murdered. And there was no trace of them that. But it could be so. I don't see the evidence. But there's always been that connection with the Irish, particularly the Druids, before Christianity again, had a connection to ancient Kemet. And the Gypsies do too. This is an interesting story about the Gypsies because it comes from Egyptos, which is the Greek name for Egypt. The whole introduction to the tarot in Egypt came from Kemet, came from Egypt, because that's how they used to teach in the temples using flashcards. Show you a picture, and you had to verbalize to the teacher what the symbol meant. And that becomes the tarot. Tarot. Tarot is an old Commission word.
Exactly. So I'm looking forward, Stephen, with the backlash that we've experienced, because like my experiences have not been as positive as yours. What can we do in moving forward in honoring not only the academic aspects, but also our internal connection to the goddess and matriarchal cultures? What do you think we can do to move forward with this?
Again, that's support. I mean, those that have done the work. Again, I mentioned Barbara Lesko. There were other women that wrote in the 70s that talked strongly about goddess worship. And again, Merlin Stone is another woman named June Singer. I mean, incredible. She wrote a book called Androgyny. And she was a student of Kinsey as well as Masters of Johnson. It's to support those that have been there. Again, to let people know that they're not alone. I mean, that there is this tradition. It's there. And matriarchy is clear. I mean, again, read my book, Land of Osiris. We talk about clearly that ancient Kemet was matriarchy. I mean, yes. I mean, so it's the support. And you're going to write your own book. And you're going to continue to work.
That's right. So, will you do the foreword for it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would love to.
That'd be awesome.
And a lot of these ladies are still alive. They're my age. They're in their 70s, but they're still alive. My very, very good friend, she still, I believe, teaches at the University of California at Berkeley. Her name was Margaret Conkey. She actually got me involved in a lot of archaeology. She got me involved to do archaeology. And they're still around. I'm sure some of these ladies are still around. I would look up, Google Barbara Lesko, Lesko. She taught Egyptology at Brown University. And she wrote the book, The Remarkable Women of Ancient Egypt. So she promoted it.
I was researching to interview you because I knew that she had influenced you. I looked her up and then I ordered one of her books because I realized I didn't have any of her books. So I'll let you know.
And she would be a great person to interview because she caught a lot of flack. But they all did. We all did. And you just have to realize there's still that patriarchy is dying and screaming. It doesn't want to go. So that people are hanging on. And a lot of men want to hold on to the male superiority myth. And that was one myth that has no basis in fact. Because the truth of the matter is, if any man goes through his life with any kind of spiritual understanding, he will realize that women are infinitely more spiritual than men are, and infinitely more spiritually stronger. The physicalness has nothing to do with it. And as I mentioned now, there is a woman in the world who can beat the hell out of most men physically anyway. Her name is Ronda Rousey. And so it's not a question of muscles and hormones and androgens and testosterone, blah, blah, blah. It is the fact that we are who we are. We all have power, we all have strength, and we all have to find out for ourselves who we are. That is the goal. That is the mission that Hakim realized. When somebody, I want to leave this with you because you have an anthropology background. I'm reviewing some old tapes now of Hakim that led to what was known as the Pyramid Code. He talks about the oral tradition. And somebody says to him, what was the oral? He introduced, why did you not accept the Greek version of Egyptology as the history? He said, were you told stories? He said, no. I was told certain things, but no. He said, I always thought, and then they thought that what we considered the oral tradition was children sitting around the campfire where the elders tell the story as they do in Native American traditions today, and that's the oral tradition. He said, no, that's patriarchy. Because again, it's parents telling the children what to think. What is the paradigm? How we came to be, who we are? No. He said to him the oral tradition was to know that we have these capabilities within us, masculine, feminine, these senses, 360, and we go out and we find out the truth for us. And that's the truth. That's how it is. We have to realize this understanding of ourselves, forget about it. It comes to a point where you got to go through academia, but you have to get past academia. Because as I said,
exactly.
And this is why I used in my first book, the great work of Thomas Kuhn in the 50s. He actually coined the phrase paradigm shift. And he said, most of the great changes in science came from outside of science. Albert Einstein was working as a Swiss patent clerk when he came up with general theory of relativity. Tesla was outside of academia. All of the great scientists of history made their discoveries outside the academic realm. And that's what we're finding. That's what chematology is, way beyond Egyptology. But you have to have that basis. And I tell people, this is why you have to study. And this is why you can tell them there is an academic tradition of goddess worship and mythology. Many people have written many scholarly works. M. Esther Harding, another one. There's so many. I could go on and on and on.
Well, guys, we're at the top of the hour. Great
Right.
listening to you guys. I'm so enthralled in the show. Great to see you there, Heather, as well, with the Goddess Mythology.
Oh yeah, and
Thank you.
you Irish leprechauns come from the goddess too.
That's
Wow.
right. A great goddess culture in Ireland. Love
Oh, the
it.
Tuatha De Danann, the Tuatha De Danann.
That's right. Eru,
The people of the goddess Danu, the Danube,
Danu. That's
Denmark.
right.
They're all named for her.
Exactly. Exactly.
Wow. Well, listen, guys, it's great talking to you. We're going to wrap it up at that.
Okay, my man.
Always great talking to you, Stephen. Always great to see you.
I
And
love
Heather,
it, James.
you
Oh,
are an
love it.
awesome credit to Capricorn Radio.
She
So
is
Aw,
great.
thank you, James.
She is good. This is going to be a great show. You're going to get a lot of likes on this one, believe me.
Aw, well, thank you, Stephen. You're amazing. You're
Thank you.
just
You are
awesome.
too. I'd love
Such
to
a
be
pleasure.
Let's keep in touch.
Yes, I will
Bye.
definitely. Definitely. Thank you so much.